A hallmark of authoritarianism is state-sponsored fiction, spectacle with no relationship to reality other than the political and emotional needs of a despot.
A diplomatic meeting turned ambush.
False claims the nation is engaged in genocide against white farmers.
Death, burial sites, over 1,000 of white farmers.
We've come to the location shown in that video played in the Oval Office. There are no graves. There's no graveyard.
It's a genocide that's taking place.
Though Trump's administration has banned all refugees, they are now making an exception for one group, white South Africans.
The U.S. threw out the South African ambassador to the United States.
As Sisonke and I writes in her memoir, Always Another Country, violence in South Africa is real. In part 2 of our conversation, I press her for a grain of truth in Mr. Trump's white genocide fable. We examine its origins, its current incarnation, and the reception of the most recent episode. I want to reflect on this sort of crowdsourced, populist way that the people of South Africa are responding, especially young people, making Trump a laughingstock in ways that really, it doesn't happen here.
Yeah, it's been very interesting as a genuine nation-building exercise for South Africans of all races to watch this Trump nonsense. Trump has really given us this ability to really wonderfully celebrate, what we've become. The white South Africans who are left in the country, who continue to live in South Africa, are the people who want to be there and who genuinely can make a joke out of this guy in America who's saying their lives are so terrible. Images of white people going about their business in South Africa and dancing, a moment of joy that a white person will have, surrounded by Black people. Because let's remember, white people are about 7% of the population in South Africa. So there's never a moment as a white person that you would be walking around not surrounded by Black people. So these beautiful scenes of like a white person at a concert, dancing and really jiving and getting down sort of harmoniously with Black people all around them, doing nothing terrible, right? So there's so many fabulous, creative, hilarious memes. And of course, white people waking up in the morning and being served their coffee and tea by, a maid in the garden, watching as someone is mowing their lawn and saying, with the sound of Donald Trump in the background saying terrible things are happening in South Africa. So
the meeting in the Oval Office with the South African president, I haven't seen it yet, for the same reason that I stopped watching professional wrestling when I was 14. And to the degree that I'm interested in professional wrestling again because of Trump, I'm more interested in the consumers of propaganda than the government purveyors of propaganda.
Yeah.
People are interested to know the backstory behind this white genocide. And you wrote an article for The Intercept.
So really, this idea of a white genocide has been propagated since long before apartheid even began. So this notion that white South Africans who were a small minority, that somehow Black people would, if they had the opportunity, would slit their throats, is one of the oldest tropes in racism that we know of, right? And so, of course, it's easy to activate and reactivate it whenever you need to, right? And so politicians of integrity would deactivate it, and politicians who have no integrity would activate it. So it's been used throughout the history of white South Africa. It's, in fact, the idea that was activated for us to have apartheid in the first place. In the 1930s, the Great Depression hits the world, South African economy tanks. We have a white minority that runs the country, but we were beholden to the British because we're a colony. The ones who ruled were of British ancestry. And so the Afrikaners began to feel disgruntled, dominated by, the British whites. And so you begin to have this narrative that says, there's Black people all around us, we're threatened by them. And then these British have their feet on our neck, right? And so this is an old trope that I think gets recycled over and over again. Fast forward to 1994, these fears that apartheid was over and now Black people were going to exercise revenge. And then, of course, that doesn't happen. And in fact, the opposite happens, right? We have this incredible narrative of forgiveness, of tolerance, that we're building a new nation together. And so it never happens. And yet it continues to surface, right? Being sort of mobilized by, I think politicians of bad faith. By the time we reach the White House, what's been happening for the last 10 years is a re-energizing of this trope. And it's a re-energizing by a new generation of Afrikaner leaders, a group called AfriForum, a group called Solidarity, which is a white trade union. Tap into this old idea that Black people are trying to kill them. And it has some cachet because, of course, South Africa is a deeply, deeply violent society as an after effect of apartheid. This is how violence lingers. Violence begets violence. And in the kind of aftermath of apartheid, we have a lot of crime. Now, that crime isn't targeted at white people. That crime is targeted against people who have. So there's a new rising Black middle class, which has absolutely been the target of that crime. We also know that crime is targeted against your neighbors, the people who look just like you. And so the biggest victims of crime in South Africa, of course, are other Black people. But yes, we definitely have a crime problem. And so we have this narrative, this trope, and it finds its way to the White House through a very orchestrated campaign that includes your Steve Bannons, your
Tucker Carlson, Charlie Kirk,
all of these sort of right-wing podcasters. That network has been disseminating this, propagating these ideas, which are really, as close as we can get to a fiction, as you can call it. They've been propagating this for at least a decade.
I feel like I should have learned my lesson after they're eating our cats, they're eating our dogs.
Eating our dogs.
And not even ask the question, is there a grain of truth? Because J.D. Vance just came out and said, no, we made it up because it was good for the election. And there's a lot of people who hate immigrants.
Yeah.
But, 65 million people in South Africa, somewhere there must have been.
No, there's no such thing. If there is, it's known to the criminals themselves, right? What you have had are very poor relations between farm workers and farmers, which are poor relations that are on the basis of exploitation, right? So you've had farmers who have, farmed the land for many generations. You have farm workers who live in appalling conditions. People can look this up. There are many, many Human Rights Watch reports that document the very, very poor state of living for farm workers. And so you might have had some retaliatory violence in those settings. Nothing organized or orchestrated, certainly nothing that could be called a genocide, and certainly nothing that could even be called a movement, right? So if an individual has had an employer who has exploited them and often violently exploited them, and they have an interpersonal conflict with that individual who happens to be white, but also is being retaliated against because of the material conditions in which they find themselves on that particular person's farm, I guess you might be able to call that a grain of truth. Mm-hmm. But there's no genocide. And in fact, quite the opposite. South Africa, after 1994, I think it's important for people to know this. When we negotiated our new constitution, one of the fundamental tenets was the protection of minority rights. And that was specifically put in there to protect the rights of white South Africans. I think what's most irritating about this entire experience is that the experience of South Africans since 1994 has been one of bending over backward to accommodate, to show grace, to show tolerance, and to say that white South Africans are welcome. It's our collective country, and that what we are doing in the wake of Nelson Mandela is this experiment on how you live together. And that has not been without its troubles. So I'm certainly not saying it's been a rainbow nation. But what I am saying is that from a political perspective, when you argue that there is a white genocide, then that implies that there's a leadership that is carrying out, giving command to, and saying, kill all the whites. And that simply is not true.
Charlie Kirk's segment included this murder of 2 women, and blood was written on the wall that said "kill the boer." Did that happen?
Again, that hasn't. Again, that's never been verified. So that story about, the murder on the walls and the blood written has never been proven to be. That's a claim that sort of hangs in the air.
We have thousands of stories talking about it. Sure. And we have documentaries, we have news stories. And then we turn the lights down, and just put this on. It's right behind you.
the song Kill the Boer, so even the translation, even putting it into English, makes it sound different from the original sort of, when it's sung in Xhosa or when it's sung in isiZulu, right? So already you strip it and you simplify it and you make it even more crude. But in fact, a Boer, if we are just to use the real meaning of the word, a Boer is a farmer. In Afrikaans, that is what a Boer is. So when you say in the context, not today, but when we used to sing in the freedom struggle, in the freedom days, the freedom struggle that my family was very much a part of, when you sing Kill the Boer, you're saying symbolically, kill those who have taken our land. It's very important that the song doesn't say kill the white person. The song says kill those who have taken our land. And it's symbolism, right? It was the subject of a high court and then a constitutional court decision, and it is now protected speech. So that's why that guy continues to sing it with impunity. And it's also why South Africans, black and white, continue to debate it, with many black people saying, why are you still singing that song 30 years later? That song has no place in our society. And that's why it had to go to court. And the court initially said, yep, it has no place in the society. And then it was reversed, and the constitutional court said it's protected speech because it comes from a particular era. And so they added all that context. This then zooms into the White House in front of people who have no idea of history. And now we either have to defend it or we have to disavow it. And there's no ability to actually talk about the gray zone in which all of these conversations and all of these things live.
One thing I learned from Tim Tyson, a historian of African American history, is that so often these narratives are pushed at a time when there's a policy issue. Brown v. Board,
Yes.
The right of African Americans to vote, calls back all of the black beast rapist kind of narratives that were used to install our version of apartheid in the 1870s through 1890s.
That's right.
So in South Africa, there's actually some policy issues that are actually really behind this. So could you explain those?
Absolutely. It's a very similar, great analogy. Because the deal that was struck at the end of apartheid was that white people would keep their land, their property, that property rights are enshrined in our constitution, that no one has a right to take your stuff off of you. So that was the deal. And what that, of course, means is that it bakes into the new political agreement that white people will keep all of what they've always had, and black people who continue to be dispossessed of their land will have to figure out a way to make do with the small percentage of the land that they came into the deal with, right? So this is a recipe for disaster. Anyone looking at it objectively can see that this is not going to work. And so there have been lots of contestations about land, policy contestation, lots of rhetoric, lots of talk in the media for many, many years. And so finally, this, under significant pressure from young people, from high unemployment rates, from increasing poverty, under significant pressure, the African National Congress government eventually says, okay, we're going to do something about this land thing. There's a willing buyer, willing seller program that is tried with marginal success. And so eventually this land expropriation bill is tabled, and immediately we go straight into those old tropes. They're going to kill us for our land. They're going to take our land off of us. This is unfair. And the expropriation bill essentially says where land has been fallow, where the owners are not contactable, where they're not using that land, the state has a right to expropriate that land and then use it for its own purposes. It's not radical at all. This is a very common practice all around the world. I think it's common in the United States as well.
We have it. It's called eminent domain.
Yeah.
The government can take land, and it doesn't have to be fallow. It doesn't have to be unattended or nothing. They can just take it if they think it's in the public interest.
So ours is even more mild.
More conservative.
Even more conservative. Because remember, we've had to be conservative because the markets are so nervous about this black government that has dominion over this gold and this diamonds and this, supposedly complex, economy. So we have a very deeply moderate instinct in the African National Congress government. And so we have this very mild response to a very significant, very radical situation, and it all hell breaks loose. And so if you track the beginning of the tours by the Afrikaners, by AfriForum and by Solidarity, if you track when they start raising this alarm about rising levels of violence against them, they track almost, parallel with the beginnings of these conversations about this land expropriation bill, which has now become an act, which will and has not changed very much, unfortunately, in our country.
You know, I'm so accustomed to seeing our president use other people's conflicts and issues as a stage for his professional wrestling show. But what actually happened here was that leaders in South Africa of the Afrikaner population essentially were using Trump. And I understand from your writing that the people who pushed this genocide idea are all backtracking and really apologizing because Trump is saying he wants to punish the whole country for this fantasist notion of a genocide.
Mr. President, on Truth Social, you said that you were going to cut aid from South Africa. Will you plan to cut aid across other African nations, and why South Africa?
No, it's only South Africa. Terrible things are happening in South Africa. The leadership is doing some terrible things. Horrible thing. So that's under investigation right now. We'll make a determination. And until such time as we find out what South Africa is doing, they're taking away land, they're confiscating land, and actually they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
I think it was February 2nd. I did see this clip. To me, it seemed like, well, maybe he wasn't sure if it was true. It sounded good enough that he was willing to float it out there and make, our foreign policy based on it. It may be funny to your people. To us, it's just, it's alarming because our president can be suckered by just the stupidest idea. As long as it's racist enough to be useful to him, he will believe anything. And then he has millions of worshipers who will believe it too.
I mean, I think it's more complicated than Trump is suckered. I think you're right. It is professional wrestling. And the people in the professional wrestling are not suckers. They're playing a game for millions of people who pay money to watch them play that game. And this is essentially what Trump is doing. I think the manner of his delivery and his complete lack of seeming seriousness as a person is what has made South Africans laugh and the rest of the world laugh at Trump. I mean, if he weren't so dangerous, it really would be a lot funnier. But I think for us, the real humor in this entire situation has been this notion that the very people who are so entitled, so privileged, have so very much must flee. Terrible things are happening in South Africa. Really is they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs.
This is what you wrote in your Intercept article. This white nationalist ideology is deploying white victimhood to make their position more socially acceptable.
I think it's a complicated story because, of course, we have a government of national unity that is comprised now. So the African National Congress, after Nelson Mandela, it continues to be in power. It's 30 years later. The party is still in power because people had huge respect for Mandela and for that liberation movement. So people will always see that party as the people who liberated us from the apartheid regime, right? But of course, after that, you then begin to have a coalescing of white resentment. So you had the old Afrikaners who were the Dutch settlers, and you had the British, right? And they come together as whites because their privilege is now collectively gone, right? So they come together, they form a new political party, and they very much play into the resentments and the kind of sort of old gripes. They do so in a kind of more moderate way. So they're kind of the respectable face of racism.
Yeah.
So they're not as dramatic and right leaning. So for those people, you can absolutely continue to live in South Africa, moan and complain about the potholes and how things aren't the way that they used to be, without believing that there's a white genocide, right? So we certainly have that element of people.
Yeah.
Nobody lost their houses. The status quo was very, very much maintained. And so what really the real story of post-apartheid South Africa is a story, for many, many Black people, a story of betrayal. And for many white people, a story about guilt and shame, even though all the escape hatches were given to them to not feel guilt and to not feel shame. But I think it's really difficult to live in an unequal society and not be ashamed. And so what is the thing we go to rather than shame? I think defensiveness turns shame into victimhood.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
And so you create a story for yourself.
Yeah. I mean, without the white victimhood, then honestly, you have to accept that we are all the inheritors of such incredible injustice, and not just the privilege, but the ideology. It's nothing but terrorism.
Absolutely.
Another reason why it hurts us, maybe more than it's hurting you, is that the only refugees in the world that we are bringing here right now are these people who, even though they still had all the privileges of being white, but they weren't quite as successful as they wanted to be. But people who are facing real problems are being blocked from coming here as refugees. And why? Because they're not white. So I think it's just a fiendish irony that our countries have swapped places. This is how you end your article in The Intercept. In the pillaring of Trump's commitment to this crude racism that South Africa walked away from 3 decades ago, the Afrikaners in America have become a symbol of the country South Africa no longer wants to be. And I mean, I'm sure that's how you're looking at it, but we feel like in swapping places, it's our country as a whole that looks that way to the world. You and I are old enough to remember apartheid South Africa and the way that looked to the world.
Yeah.
A lot of Americans today aren't, but that's how my country looks now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very sad. Very sad. So beyond the flippancy, because I think that, there's an affect of flippancy.
Sure.
But in reality, given what America has meant for so many people, despite all its flawed narrative and despite, there was always a sense that America was a place that in its story about itself was trying to be something better than both what it was and better than every other place on this planet.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, and so that narrative has been like torn up. It's like what we are going to do as Americans is be small, petty, and narrow, and we're going to focus not just on ourselves, but only on those of us that we decide are special and important. And it's just very, it's very, very sad.
Right. I mean, we have now the travel ban. So not only have we paused all the refugee programs, but now we have travel bans on a number of countries in Africa and Asia.
Honestly, I think part of the other travesty about this, America pausing its refugee programs with the rest of the world is that it's not just that they're pausing refugee programs in places where people are in dire need. They're also pausing refugee programs in places where they created the problem. They created the reasons why people need to seek refuge.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a rolling back of a set of very serious promises that America has made to people. You don't easily win that back. That kind of mercurialness from a state is not easy to, it's not easy to win that kind of trust back from people.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll be starting over, whenever this ends.
Yeah.
This is reminding me, I think, of another mythology that we should address. And I know you know that it should be addressed because you talk about it in Always Another Country. You felt that the leaders of the ANC betrayed your trust in them. And you said recently, there's very few of them that you would trust with your future.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, when we installed our version of apartheid, in order to do that, we had to do a lot of killing here. A lot of killing. One by one, the democracies of the South fell to terrorists. And one of the stories that they told to justify it, along with the Black Beast rapist mythology that was the subject of our last episode, but another was that anytime you have anyone other than white men in government, everything will go wrong.
Will fall apart.
And it's sort of reflected in Trump's shithole countries comment.
Yes.
Or the way he talks about the parts of the United States where we have elected Black mayors.
That's right.
So now we have to grapple, with your disappointment in the ANC and the fact that it reinforces that mythology.
It can reinforce that mythology if you want it to, but I think again, I'm always trying to be better than that. So what I'm saying is, in the South African context, the current white political leaders would be so much worse than the ANC. So what I'm saying is the ANC is not good enough. And that has nothing to do with their race. It has to do with their betrayal. So my lack of belief in the ANC has nothing to do with the fact that they're Africans.
Yeah, of course.
The white people who continue to be in leadership positions are just shocking. Bad leaders, incompetent, incapable of imagining what a future looks like in a multiracial way. And so they cling to resentments in a way that is, completely insufficient as well. And I think a lot of people for a long time have struggled to criticize our political leadership in South Africa, because the minute you do, then you open yourself up to all these things. Well, what are you saying, that white people rule better? And of course not. It's too simplistic, right? So always trying to have a more complicated conversation than what black and white will always want to pull us back into.
When you talk about a pandemic ravaging South Africa, and someone that you more than just voted for, someone that I believe you might have known as a child, is that right?
Yeah.
Is failing your country.
Yeah.
And you write, it was so important for him to look like he was in charge, that it was so important for him to be right, and his ego caused him to sacrifice his people.
That's right.
Does HIV cause AIDS? The question is, does a virus cause a syndrome? How does a virus cause a syndrome? It can't.
For nearly a decade, President Mbeki questioned AIDS statistics, the efficacy of antiretroviral drugs, saying they were toxic, and suggested poverty and poor nutrition caused AIDS. Critics say Mbeki's handling of the AIDS crisis caused more than 300,000 preventable deaths.
Tell me about how you came through on the other side from that, or have you?
That's a good question. Have I? I think the last 30 years have been a process of trying to come to terms with fallen heroes. Trying to understand the balance between love and respect and loyalty in political movements. And I think we all have to figure out, what do we do with disappointment? Because putting people on pedestals is so unhealthy. And we see what it means to put someone on a pedestal the way that, the MAGA people put, a Trump on the pedestal. And he's so obviously flawed and he's so obviously ridiculous, right? But again, what's important is the phenomenon, less the person, right? And so I think lots of people would ask similar questions about, like, the Democrats and an allegiance to people, this Biden thing, this, like, you can't criticize. And where does that take us? So the inability to say the difficult thing is the problem here. And so I think political disappointment is extremely important. And it's very good for democracy for people to disappoint us, because it mobilizes us, rallies us. It shatters something that in some ways can't be put together again. And that's very, very good.
Yeah.
We really need that.
Well, you write that it freed you.
It did. It freed me to have a it was horrible to have a president who was so committed to being right that he was able to oversee hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people dying of AIDS. And it felt like South Africa becomes free, and then within a couple of years, we're in the middle of this AIDS epidemic. It's like winning a house in the lottery and then realizing that you're in the path of a tornado. This moment of freedom turns into this horrifying moment where everything is about to be taken away from us. But yeah, I think political disappointment is an important instinct.
Well, when I was reading that, and of course you wrote it before the COVID pandemic, but when I was reading that, it sounded exactly like Trump's behavior.
Yeah. And look, he's put in a denialist as his Minister of Health. Or what do you call it? Secretary of
Health and Human Services, RFK Jr., yeah.
Yeah, another very sad story.
Well, but let's focus on the consumers of the propaganda more so than the purveyors.
Absolutely.
So for you, and maybe for a lot of South Africans, I don't know, but for you, allowing hundreds of thousands of your fellow human beings to die needlessly of AIDS, that created a rift, and a freeing one, but it created a rift.
Yeah.
For these Trump followers, what are you going to do? What are you going to do?
As you keep saying, and I think it's a really important point, it's less about the propagandists and it's more about the factors that make people want to believe. And I think for Americans, reality is really hard to deal with.
Yeah.
Trump is escapism for many, many Americans.
Mm-hmm.
They get to believe in the fantasy of, the resentments that he holds and all this stuff, but he's deeply entertaining.
Yeah.
And real life for many, many Americans has not been fun for a really long time,
mm-hmm.
particularly the kind of Americans who like Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
The moment really calls for Americans to reflect on what it means to be an American and to divorce that idea from an allegiance to a president.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of people recognize that Trump is not America. He's a particular kind of American who has always existed and whose, rise has been enabled by a whole set of forces, including a real diminishment of American education systems in this moment, a very weak and vulnerable moment in US history.
And powerful technology that can really mess with the soft tissues of our brain.
And this new thing that has never happened before, which is this technology. So we get that. We get that. Americans need to remember how much they've taught the world, how much American ambition, and even though I criticize it, American individualism and the capacity to describe the world as it ought to be is so much of what I learned as a student in America, right? The capacity of my, African-American professors and those pastors in those churches that I went to religiously every Sunday to explain not just injustice, but more importantly, justice. Like America is really the place where my coming of age politically happened.
Yeah.
And it happened because people were expressing to me not just what injustice felt like, but what justice might look like. And so I have every belief in the world that the kind of, fighting spirit of Americans is so much bigger than what Trump represents. The guy's term is 4 years. He'll be gone. And hopefully, Americans can heal from the wounds that he inflicts on the body politic. I mean, that's my biggest concern, right? And I think that's what the world is hoping for Americans.
Thank you so much. And thank you for going overtime longer than I said you would.
No worries. No worries.
Now you got 3 minutes for food. Wrestling Darkness is written, recorded, and edited by yours truly, Eric Byler. The music is composed by Michael Brook, while this jazzy improv rendition you are hearing now was performed by David Benene and Stephen Munoz. Wrestling Darkness and other content you will find on the Eric Byler Substack feed are supported by a 501c3 nonprofit called ID Alliance. You can support us by subscribing or by making a tax-deductible donation. Thanks for listening.